Welcome to a story history tried to bury. For more than 150 years, a hidden system operated in the shadows, quietly enslaving boys and girls long after the world claimed slavery was over. This isn't a rumor or a legend. It's built on court records, forgotten laws, and testimonies that took years of real research to uncover. As you listen, comment below and tell us where you're watching from, and if you value deeply researched, true dark history like this, subscribe, because finding and verifying these stories takes enormous effort, and your support keeps them alive. When slavery was officially abolished, the world was told a comforting lie, that chains had been broken and freedom had finally arrived. Laws were celebrated, declarations were read aloud, and nations congratulated themselves on moral progress. But abolition on paper did not mean abolition in practice. Beneath the surface, new legal language quietly replaced old cruelty, creating the illusion of freedom while preserving the same control, the same labor extraction, and the same suffering, especially for children. The end of slavery created an economic crisis for those who had built their wealth on unpaid labor. Plantations, factories, and local governments suddenly faced the loss of a workforce they believed they were entitled to. Rather than accept change, lawmakers and officials searched for loopholes, ways to maintain control without openly violating abolition laws. What they found was legality itself. By rewriting definitions, inventing new categories, and weaponizing minor offenses, they kept the system alive under a different name. Abolition laws often included vague exceptions: punishment for crimes, unpaid, apprenticeships, state custody, or forced labor as correction. These exceptions became the gateway. Children, especially poor, orphaned, or racially targeted children, were swept into these categories with frightening ease. A boy without parents, a girl accused of vagrancy, a child who missed school, any of them could be declared legally unfree without the word slave ever being used. Courts played a central role in maintaining the illusion. Judges claimed they were acting in the child's best interest, sentencing boys and girls to rehabilitation through labor. On paper, it looked humane. In reality, these children were leased out, sold in contracts, and forced to work brutal hours under violent supervision. Because the law called it correction, not slavery, the public rarely questioned it. Communities were encouraged to believe this system was necessary. Newspapers described these children as troublemakers, criminals, or burdens on society. Reform institutions were marketed as places of discipline and opportunity, not confinement. The language softened the truth, allowing ordinary citizens to look away while children vanished into farms, mines, kitchens, and factories, often never returning. Parents who tried to resist found the law stacked against them. Poverty itself was treated as neglect. Families were declared unfit, and children were seized legally, permanently. Once labeled wards of the state, boys and girls lost their identities. They became labor units, assigned where profit demanded, protected by no one, and heard by no court willing to challenge the system. This is how abolition became a performance rather than a reality. Slavery didn't end, it evolved, hiding behind stamps, signatures, and official seals. For over a century, the world believed children were free, while thousands lived and died in bondage that was invisible, not because it was hidden, but because it was legally permitted. After slavery was outlawed, power didn't disappear. It reorganized itself through language. One of the most effective tools was the invention of new legal identities that sounded protective, but were anything but. Words like custody, apprenticeship, and guardianship replaced the word ownership, allowing authorities to claim moral high ground while exercising the same absolute control over children's lives. So-called apprenticeship laws became the backbone of this system. Officials argued that children without stable families needed guidance, discipline, and training. In practice, these laws allowed courts to bind boys and girls to private individuals or institutions for years at a time, often until adulthood. There was no consent, no wages, and no realistic path to release. The child belonged to the system, even if the law insisted otherwise. Local governments quickly realized how profitable this arrangement could be. Judges assigned children to employers who paid fees to the state, turning courts into labor distribution centers. The more children declared in need of supervision, the more money flowed. This created a dangerous incentive to criminalize poverty and childhood itself, ensuring a constant supply of free labor. Minor offenses were enough to trigger lifelong consequences. Skipping school, loitering, talking back, or simply being homeless could result in a child being declared delinquent. Once labeled, the process moved fast and without defense. Hearings lasted minutes, parents were rarely present. Decisions were final. A single accusation could strip a child of freedom for years. The law pretended these arrangements were temporary and beneficial, but oversight was almost non-existent. Employers were supposed to provide education and care, yet inspections were rare and easily manipulated. Abuse went unpunished, injuries went unrecorded, and deaths were quietly ignored. Because the system was legal, suffering was treated as acceptable collateral. Girls were often placed into domestic service under the same laws, hidden behind closed doors where violence and exploitation thrived. Boys were sent to fields, workshops, and industrial sites far beyond their strength. The law made no distinction between protection and profit. It served both, as long as the paperwork was complete. By replacing slavery with legal custody, the system achieved something terrifying. It made exploitation respectable. It allowed officials to claim reform while preserving domination, ensuring that generations of children lived in bondage without the world ever calling it what it truly was. To make the system work, children first had to be transformed in the public imagination, from victims into offenders. Authorities discovered that if a child could be labeled a criminal, almost any treatment could be justified. The definition of crime was quietly expanded, especially for the poor. Behaviors once seen as signs of hardship were reframed as moral failures that demanded punishment. New categories like vagrancy, incorrigibility, and coital behavior were deliberately vague. A boy standing on a street corner too long, a girl wandering without supervision, or a child begging for food could all be accused of breaking the law. These were not crimes with victims, but they carried severe consequences. Once accused, a child entered a legal pipeline designed not to correct behavior, but to remove freedom. Children rarely understood what they were charged with. Courtrooms were intimidating, rushed, and deeply biased. Judges spoke in legal language children couldn't comprehend and made decisions within minutes. There were no lawyers advocating for them, no appeals, and no meaningful way to tell their side of the story. A child's future could be decided faster than a traffic violation. Once declared delinquent, the label followed them everywhere. It erased sympathy and replaced it with suspicion. Communities were told these children were dangerous, unruly, or beyond saving. This narrative made it easier to accept their disappearance into institutions, farms, or private homes. After all, the public believed they were being punished, not exploited. The criminal label also stripped children of credibility. When abuse occurred, and it often did, their complaints were dismissed as lies from troublemakers. Injuries were blamed on disobedience. Trauma was treated as evidence of bad character. The system protected itself by ensuring the child's voice carried no weight. For many children, the label was permanent. Even after years of forced labor, they were released with no education, no support, and a record that followed them into adulthood. Employers saw the past accusation, not the child's survival. The punishment extended far beyond confinement. It shaped the rest of their lives. By turning childhood poverty into criminality, the system solved its greatest obstacle, public outrage. Once children were seen as offenders instead of innocents, their suffering became acceptable. This was not justice. It was a carefully constructed illusion that allowed slavery to continue, hidden behind the false authority of the law. The system survived by disguising exploitation as education. Forced labor was rebranded as reform, training, or character building, giving the impression that children were being helped rather than abused. Officials claimed that hard work would discipline troubled youth, teaching them responsibility and morality. In reality, labor was the punishment and profit was the goal. Institutions advertised themselves as places of rehabilitation, industrial schools, reform farms, and training homes. Behind their gates, boys and girls worked long, exhausting hours with little or no instruction of any kind. The promised education rarely existed. Classrooms were symbolic, used for inspections and reports, while the real curriculum was endless labor. Children were assigned work far beyond their physical limits. Boys hauled timber, dug trenches, worked machinery, and labored in fields from dawn until night. Girls scrubbed floors, cooked for dozens, washed clothes by hand, and worked in factories or private homes. Injuries were common, exhaustion was constant, and rest was treated as disobedience. Punishment reinforced the system. Whippings, isolation, food deprivation, and public humiliation were routine responses to fatigue or resistance. Supervisors justified cruelty as discipline, insisting that suffering was necessary for reform. Because the children were labeled delinquents, abuse was not only tolerated, it was expected. Wages were never paid to the children themselves. Any money exchanged went to institutions, courts, or private contractors. Children were told their labor was repaying a debt to society, even when no real crime had been committed. The longer they worked, the deeper that imaginary debt seemed to grow. There was no clear end date. Some children were told they would be released after improvement, only to find their sentences extended without explanation. Others were transferred from one labor site to another as they aged, ensuring continued usefulness. Freedom was always promised, rarely delivered. By disguising forced labor as reform, the system neutralized moral opposition. To the outside world, these children were being saved. Inside, they were trapped in a cycle of work and punishment that differed from slavery in name only, proof that cruelty survives most easily when it pretends to be care. Many of the most trusted institutions in society played a hidden role in sustaining this system, especially orphanages. Publicly, they were seen as places of refuge, safe havens for children who had lost parents or fallen into poverty. Privately, many functioned as holding centers, preparing boys and girls for forced placement into labor under the guise of care and protection. Children entered these orphanages through tragedy, poverty, or court order. Once inside, their freedom effectively ended. Administrators had sweeping authority to decide a child's future, often without oversight. Records were altered, ages were changed, and family connections were erased, making it easier to claim the child had no one to return to. Life inside was harsh and regimented. Food was scarce, discipline was strict, and affection was nearly non-existent. From an early age, children were conditioned to obey without question. They were told repeatedly that survival depended on compliance, preparing them psychologically for the labor awaiting them outside the institution's walls. When employers needed workers, orphanages supplied them. Boys and girls were placed out to farms, factories, workshops, or private homes, often miles away from anyone who might recognize them. Contracts were signed between adults, while the children themselves had no say. Once sent away, many were never seen again by the institution that claimed to protect them. Official reports described these placements as opportunities, chances for children to learn skills and become productive citizens. In reality, oversight vanished the moment the child was transferred. Letters went unanswered, complaints were ignored. Abuse thrived in isolation, protected by distance and bureaucracy. Some orphanages depended financially on these arrangements. Payments, donations, and political favor flowed to institutions that cooperated. The more children they processed, the more stable their funding became. This turned vulnerable lives into economic assets, incentivizing neglect rather than care. By hiding forced labor behind the respected image of orphanages, the system gained public trust. Society believed children were being rescued, when in fact they were being funneled into bondage. These institutions became silent gateways, transforming compassion into complicity and shelter into captivity. This system could not have survived without cooperation at the highest local levels. Judges, sheriffs, and businessmen formed an unspoken alliance, each benefiting from the arrangement while publicly claiming to uphold the law. What appeared to be justice was often a carefully coordinated exchange of power, profit, and silence. Judges were the gatekeepers. With a single ruling, they could transform a child into state property. Many of these decisions were made quickly, without evidence or defense, because the outcome was already understood. Certain employers were favored. Certain institutions were trusted. The courtroom became the first step in a supply chain, not a place of fairness. Sheriffs and police officers served as the collectors. They swept streets, poor neighborhoods, and rural areas for children who fit the profile: homeless, orphan, disobedient, or simply unwanted. Arrests were easy to justify under vague laws, and removals were carried out with force if needed. Once a child was taken, there was rarely a paper trail that led back. Businessmen completed the cycle. Plantation owners, factory managers, mine operators, and wealthy households relied on this steady flow of unpaid labor. They framed their participation as civic duty, claiming they were helping reform troubled youth. In reality, they gained workers who could not quit, complain, or demand wages. Money moved quietly between these groups. Fees, fines, placement payments, and political favors ensured smooth cooperation. No single transaction looked illegal on its own, but together they created a closed loop of exploitation. Everyone involved had a reason not to question the system, because everyone benefited from it. When abuse or death occurred, investigations stalled. Sheriffs reported nothing unusual. Judges dismissed complaints as lies from delinquents. Business owners blamed accidents or disobedience. Accountability dissolved as responsibility passed endlessly between offices that protected one another. This collaboration was the system's greatest strength. It blurred the line between law enforcement and profiteering, turning justice into a marketplace. As long as judges signed orders, sheriffs enforced removals, and businessmen demanded labor, the enslavement of children continued, legally, efficiently, and almost invisibly. Once children were labeled delinquent, the next step was simple: send them where labor was needed. For boys, that often meant being leased out to farms, plantations, or industrial sites where physical strength was demanded and compassion was scarce. The system treated them like tools, valuable only for what they could produce and replaceable the moment they broke down. In rural areas, boys were sent to work fields from dawn to dusk, doing back-breaking tasks like plowing, harvesting, and clearing land. They lived in harsh conditions, sleeping in cramped quarters, eating minimal food, and receiving no education. Their work was not framed as learning, it was simply work, and they were expected to endure it without complaint. Factories and workshops were even more dangerous. Boys were put on machinery designed for adults, often without training or safety equipment. Injuries were common, and medical care was minimal or non-existent. If a child became too injured to work, they were simply replaced by another. The system had no interest in rehabilitation, only in output. Many boys were sent far from their homes, making escape nearly impossible. They were isolated in unfamiliar towns, surrounded by strangers who viewed them as property rather than people. Even if they managed to run away, they had no legal identity, no money, and no safe place to turn. They became easy prey for further exploitation. The work was structured to break them. Supervisors used violence, humiliation, and exhaustion to ensure obedience. Boys were punished for minor mistakes and rewarded only with the bare minimum needed to survive. This created a constant state of fear, making resistance feel suicidal. Some boys were forced into labor for wealthy households, doing chores from sunrise to night. They were not only workers but also unpaid servants, expected to be invisible and obedient. These placements often involved severe abuse, and the boys had no one to report it to because the law protected their employers. The system treated boys as an endless supply of free labor, moving them where demand was highest. They were not children with futures, only labor units with deadlines. And because the process was legal, the world looked away while these boys were exploited in plain sight. For girls, The system was even more hidden and more dangerous because their labor was placed inside private homes and closed spaces where abuse could thrive without witnesses. Once a girl was labeled delinquent or in need of supervision, she could be assigned to domestic work in wealthy households or to factories where women and girls were exploited in secrecy. The public rarely saw what happened behind closed doors, and that made the system even more effective. Domestic placements were presented as proper and respectable. Society believed that girls belonged in homes, learning manners and household skills. But the reality was far darker. Many girls were forced into endless housework, cooking, cleaning, washing, childcare, and serving, often from early morning until late at night. There was no training, no schooling, and no pay. Their labor was assumed to be part of their punishment. The danger was not just physical work, it was the constant vulnerability to abuse. In private homes, girls had no protection. Supervisors could punish them with violence, humiliation, or sexual abuse, knowing there were no witnesses, because the girls were considered delinquent. Any claim they made could be dismissed as lies or moral corruption. Some girls were placed in factories and textile mills where conditions were brutal. They worked long hours with little rest, handling dangerous machinery and toxic materials. Injuries were common, and the punishment for slowing down was severe. Girls were forced to keep working even when they were sick or injured because the employers had already paid for their labor. The system also used marriage as a tool of control. Girls could be forced into arranged marriages or domestic servitude under the pretense of stability. In these situations, they were no longer seen as children, but as property transferred from one household to another. Their consent was irrelevant, and escape was nearly impossible. The psychological toll was immense. Girls were isolated, stripped of identity, and constantly reminded that they were not free. They were told they deserved punishment, and that obedience was their only chance to survive. Over time, many internalized this belief, making the system even harder to break. The exploitation of girls was the most silent form of slavery because it was hidden in places society trusted: homes, institutions, and workplaces. This secrecy ensured that abuse could continue for decades without being challenged, leaving countless girls trapped in bondage while the world believed they were simply being cared for. The backbone of this hidden system was punishment, and it was brutal. Because the children were legally labeled as delinquent or in need of correction, authorities believed they had the right to enforce obedience through violence. Punishment wasn't occasional or exceptional. It was the default method of control. Every mistake, every sign of fatigue, every attempt at resistance was met with force, designed to break the child's spirit and ensure compliance. Whippings and beatings were common. Supervisors carried out punishment openly, sometimes in front of other children, as a warning. The violence wasn't only physical, it was psychological too. Children were humiliated, mocked, and stripped of dignity. They were told they were worthless, that no one cared about them, and that their only value was labor. This constant humiliation was a tool to erase any hope of escape or rebellion. Isolation was another form of punishment. Children were locked away, denied food, or forced to stand for hours without rest. In some cases, They were confined in small rooms or sheds, left alone with their fear. Isolation was used not just to punish, but to break their minds. When a child's world becomes small enough, resistance begins to feel impossible. Food deprivation and harsh working conditions were also used as punishment. If a child was seen as disobedient, their meals were reduced or withheld. They were forced to work longer hours without rest. This created a cruel cycle. Exhaustion led to mistakes. Mistakes led to punishment. Punishment led to more exhaustion. The system relied on this cycle to keep children obedient and weak. Punishment was justified as discipline or training. Officials claimed that the children needed tough lessons to become productive citizens, but the reality was that punishment was a tool of control. It was used to maintain the system, to keep children in place, and to prevent any form of resistance. In many cases, the children were punished for the very act of surviving. Asking for water, slowing down from exhaustion, speaking to another child, or attempting to communicate with the outside world could lead to severe consequences. The system punished basic human needs, ensuring children stayed trapped in fear. This relentless violence was not a side effect, it was central to the system's survival. It ensured that children learned quickly that disobedience meant pain, and obedience meant survival. By turning punishment into a constant, the system controlled not just bodies, but minds, trapping children in a form of slavery that was hidden behind legal language and moral excuses. Once children were taken, the system made it almost impossible for families to reclaim them. The legal structure was built to strip parents of authority and replace it with state control, and the barriers were not accidental, they were intentional. Authorities didn't simply remove children, they erased the family's right to intervene, often using the law itself as a weapon. First, families were labeled as unfit or neglectful, even when their only crime was poverty. Poverty became a justification for state intervention. A parent who could not provide enough food, stable housing, or supervision was seen as failing the child. In this way, the system turned economic hardship into a moral failure, and moral failure into legal authority. Once a family was labeled unfit, it became nearly impossible to challenge the decision. The courts also exploited bureaucracy. Families were required to navigate confusing legal processes, often without access to lawyers or proper documentation. Hearing dates were changed without notice, paperwork disappeared, and families were denied the chance to speak. Even when a parent showed up, they were treated with suspicion and dismissed as incapable. The law was used not to protect children, but to maintain control. Once a child was declared a ward of the state could legally place them wherever it chose. Parents were not informed of the child's location, and even if they were, travel costs and fear of punishment made reunification nearly impossible. Many parents didn't know where their children were sent until years later. If ever, the system relied on this distance to prevent families from reclaiming their children. Even when families tried to fight back, the system punished them. Parents who demanded their children back were accused of being disruptive or resisting authority. Some were arrested, fined, or threatened with losing their remaining children. The message was clear: the state had power, and resistance would be punished. Another barrier was the alteration or destruction of records. Children were often given new names, ages, and identities, making it difficult to prove who they were. In many cases, families searching for their children were met with false information or dead ends. Without accurate records, reunification was almost impossible. The system's goal was not just labor, it was permanence. By blocking families at every step, it ensured that children stayed within the system until they became adults. The state didn't merely control their work, it destroyed their chance of return. This is why the system could survive for so long. It removed not only freedom, but also the very possibility of escape. The most shocking part of this hidden system is how long it survived into the 1940s, decades after the world declared slavery dead. Most people assume that by the early 20th century, legal and social reforms had ended these abuses. But the truth is that the system continued because it had become embedded in local institutions, normalized by society, and protected by law. It didn't need secrecy to survive, it had legality. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, the system evolved to adapt to changing times. Instead of openly calling children slaves, officials refined the language of reform and custody. Even further, new institutions were created under the guise of charity and education, and existing ones expanded their reach. What remained constant was the forced labor and the lack of oversight. Economic factors kept the system alive. Industrialization and agricultural expansion required labor, and many regions still relied on cheap, controllable workers. Children were perfect for this because they could be molded, trained, and kept under control. Employers preferred them because they didn't demand wages or rights, and they could be punished without public backlash. This made the system profitable and difficult to dismantle. Racism and social hierarchy also ensured the system's survival. Many communities viewed certain children as less deserving of freedom. Stereotypes about criminality and poverty were used to justify continued control. Even people who opposed slavery in principle could accept these new forms of bondage because they believed the victims were troublemakers or unfit. This mindset allowed the system to continue without widespread moral outrage. Government oversight was weak or complicit. Many officials were part of the system, and investigations were rare. When reports of abuse surfaced, they were often dismissed as isolated incidents or exaggerated claims. The system survived by ensuring that it looked like a few bad cases rather than a widespread pattern. World events also distracted attention. Wars, economic depressions, and political turmoil shifted focus away from domestic abuses. As the world fought overseas and struggled economically, the hidden system continued quietly. It thrived in the gaps between public attention and legal enforcement. By the 1940s, the system was finally exposed because of growing social change and increased scrutiny. Activists, journalists, and reformers began demanding accountability, but even then, the truth was hard to accept. The system had lasted so long precisely because it was legal, normalized, and hidden in plain sight. And that is why its story remains one of the most disturbing chapters in history, because it proves that slavery can survive not only through force, but through law. The truth only came to light when evidence finally broke through decades of silence. For years, the system was protected by a combination of legal language, local power, and public ignorance. The victims were children, often poor and voiceless, and the people who benefited from their labor had every reason to keep it hidden. But eventually, documents began to surface, court records, correspondence, and institutional reports that revealed the scale of what was happening. Researchers and activists started piecing together the story from scattered fragments. Old court files showed patterns of children being declared delinquent for vague reasons and then placed into labor. Orphanage records revealed how many children were sent out and to whom. The names of employers and officials appeared repeatedly, showing a coordinated system rather than random cases. What had been dismissed as isolated incidents suddenly looked like a widespread network. Testimonies played a crucial role. As survivors grew older, they began to speak out, often risking ridicule or legal consequences. Their memories were not just emotional accounts. They were detailed descriptions of daily life, the punishments, the forced labor, and the people who controlled them. These stories provided the human evidence that records alone could not fully capture. They revealed how children were treated not as citizens, but as property. Journalists and reformers began investigating, driven by the growing belief that the country's moral progress was incomplete. Newspapers published exposés, and public pressure forced officials to respond. Investigations were launched, and the system that had been treated as normal began to be exposed as what it truly was: a form of slavery. The public was shocked because the system had been hidden behind the language of reform. The evidence also showed why it lasted so long. Because it was legal, because it involved respected institutions, and because it targeted children who had no voice, it was easy to ignore. People believed the official story that these children were being rehabilitated, not exploited. And when the truth finally emerged, it revealed how easily society can accept cruelty when it is packaged as help. In the end, the exposure forced a painful reckoning. The system was dismantled, but the damage had already been done. Generations of children had lost their childhoods, their families, and their futures. And the truth remains a haunting reminder. Slavery can survive not only through force, but through legal deception, social indifference, and the silence of those who benefit. The real horror is that the system did not collapse because people suddenly became kind. It collapsed because the truth could no longer be denied, and once denied no longer, it became impossible to ignore the fact that for over a century, children were enslaved in plain sight, hidden only by the language of the law.